The night was calm, the kind that made the air feel heavy with silence. A thin mist hung over the small town as two men, Marcus and Elijah, drove through the narrow streets, looking for a place to sit and eat. The headlights of their car glowed softly against the rain-slicked pavement, reflecting the neon sign of a dimly lit bar on the corner. They had been on the road for hours, exhausted from the long drive after months of military service overseas. The war had changed many things, their habits, their thoughts, and even the way they saw the world. Tonight, though, they weren't soldiers. They were just two brothers wanting a simple meal and a moment of peace. Marcus parked the car, and for a moment, they sat in silence, listening to the hum of the engine before turning it off. "Let's get something to eat and head back," Elijah said, rubbing his tired eyes. Marcus nodded, smiling faintly. "Yeah, just a quiet night for once." When they stepped inside the bar, the door's creak broke the stillness of the room. The warm yellow lights flickered, and conversations that had been loud moments ago suddenly died down. Every head turned toward them. It wasn't the usual curious glance given to strangers. It was something heavier. The stares carried unspoken questions, cautious, judging, measuring. Marcus felt it immediately, that familiar weight of eyes that didn't see them as people, but as outsiders. He met Elijah's gaze for a second, both silently agreeing not to react. The bartender, a middle-aged man with a rough voice, froze halfway while wiping a glass. He forced a smile, awkward and uncertain, before finally saying, "Evenin'. What can I get you?" Elijah answered politely, "Just 2 coffees and some pie, if you have it." The bartender nodded, almost too quickly, and walked away. The sound of his footsteps was the only thing that filled the room for a while. The twins sat near the window, their reflections faint in the glass, surrounded by whispers they could easily sense but not quite hear. Elijah leaned closer and whispered, "Let's just eat and leave." Marcus gave a small nod. He had been through worse things in combat, but this quiet hostility felt different, colder, more personal. He looked around the room. A few men at the counter stared at them openly, their faces unreadable. A couple sitting nearby had stopped talking altogether. It was as if their presence alone had disturbed the peace. Elijah's fingers drummed softly on the table, a nervous rhythm that betrayed the calm mask on his face. Marcus sighed quietly, reminding himself to stay composed. He didn't want trouble. They had dealt with enough chaos in their lives. Still, he couldn't ignore the ache in his chest, the ache of being unseen for who they really were. To these people, they weren't officers, heroes, or brothers who'd spent years defending others. They were just 2 unfamiliar faces in a place that didn't welcome difference. When the bartender returned with their order, his hands shook slightly as he placed the mugs on the table. "Here you go," he said, forcing a smile again. "Thanks," Marcus replied softly, his voice calm but carrying a tone that made the man pause. It was a tone of quiet dignity, one that came from someone who had learned restraint not through fear, but through experience. As they ate, the bar's murmur slowly returned, though the tension still lingered in the air. Marcus watched the rain begin to fall outside, streaking down the window like faint lines of silver. Elijah followed his gaze and said quietly, "You'd think, after all these years, things would change." Marcus didn't answer. He simply stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the cup. Deep inside, he felt a growing storm, not of anger, but of reflection. He had seen injustice in foreign lands, seen how easily people could lose their sense of humanity. Yet here, in the country he had served, he still felt the distance between hearts. Still, neither of them stood up or walked away. They stayed, quiet and steady, because walking away would mean surrendering to the very thing they stood against, ignorance. The door opened again, letting in a rush of cold wind and 2 police officers. Their boots echoed against the wooden floor, their presence sharp and official. Marcus didn't look up, but something told him that peace wouldn't last long. Elijah's shoulders tensed slightly as one of the officers glanced in their direction, his expression narrowing. The brothers exchanged a knowing look, that silent understanding they'd shared all their lives. The calm evening had begun to change, and though neither of them spoke it aloud, both knew that what was about to unfold would test not their strength as soldiers, but their patience as men who had seen too much to be broken easily. The rain outside had grown heavier, tapping softly against the windows of the bar as Marcus and Elijah sat waiting for their food. The low hum of country music played from a dusty speaker, mixing with the faint chatter that had finally returned after their arrival. But the peace was short. The wooden door swung open again with a sharp creak, and two police officers stepped inside, shaking off the rain from their jackets. Their boots made dull thuds on the floor as they walked toward the counter, scanning the room with eyes trained to look for trouble. The older one, Sergeant Miller, was tall with a hard face, his gaze sharp and suspicious. His younger partner, Officer Blake, followed close behind, his expression uncertain but imitative, like someone still learning from the wrong mentor. As Miller's eyes swept across the bar, they stopped at the corner table where Marcus and Elijah sat. He frowned immediately, his posture stiffening as though he'd found something out of place. "We've had trouble here before," he muttered under his breath, more to Blake than anyone else. The bartender gave a nervous glance toward the brothers but said nothing. Miller adjusted his belt and started walking toward their table. Elijah noticed first, his body tensing slightly. Marcus, on the other hand, remained still, stirring his coffee with quiet patience. When the officers reached their table, Miller didn't greet them or introduce himself. He just stood there, eyes fixed, and said in a flat tone, "IDs, both of you." His voice wasn't a request. It was an order. The entire room fell silent once again. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, glasses froze mid-air, and even the music seemed to fade into the background. Everyone watched, no one interfered. Elijah's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively curling into a fist beneath the table. But Marcus gave a subtle shake of his head, silently telling him to stay calm. Marcus looked up at the officer with a calm that came not from fear, but from years of discipline. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked evenly. Miller's lip curled slightly. "You tell me. You two look suspicious. Just making sure you're not causing trouble." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the room as if realizing how unnecessary this was, but he didn't speak. Marcus reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his ID, without a word, his movements measured, unthreatening. "Just doing your job, right?" he said quietly, his tone calm but firm. The officer smirked, taking the card without even glancing at the name before passing it to Blake, who read it briefly but didn't seem to recognize it. Elijah, following his brother's lead, handed his ID too, though his eyes burned with restrained anger. Marcus had always been the steady one, composed, patient, the kind who knew when silence spoke louder than words. The officer flipped through the cards as if searching for an excuse to find something wrong. "You from around here?" he asked carelessly. "Just passing through," Marcus replied, "having dinner before heading home." Miller leaned forward slightly, his voice low but edged. "You better not be causing trouble." There was no evidence, no reason, just accusation, hiding behind authority. Elijah's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table, forcing himself to stay silent. They'd both been through far worse, nights under enemy fire, the roar of chaos, where one wrong move meant death. But this quiet humiliation in their own country stung in a way that bullets never could. The officer tossed their IDs back on the table and gave a final glare before turning away. "Keep it clean," he said, as though issuing a warning rather than advice. The brothers watched as the two officers walked back to the counter, ordering drinks like nothing had happened. Around the room, No one looked directly at them, but the weight of silent judgment lingered. Marcus exhaled slowly, picking up his ID. His hand was steady, but his eyes, calm and deep, carried a storm. "You okay?" Elijah asked quietly. Marcus nodded. "Yeah," he said, though his tone was distant. For the first time that night, a crack appeared in his controlled expression. "I just forgot what it feels like to be treated like this." Elijah leaned back, his voice low. "We fight for them," he said bitterly. "People like that, every single day." Marcus's gaze shifted toward the officers laughing at the bar, unaware of who they had just disrespected, one a decorated Navy captain, the other a SEAL commander. The irony cut deep, but Marcus didn't say a word. His silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint, the kind only men with real power carried. As their food arrived, untouched and now cold, the twins exchanged a look that said more than words ever could. They'd been through battles that tested their strength, but tonight they faced something that tested their hearts. The quiet inside them wasn't peace anymore. It was awakening, a reminder that sometimes the hardest wars weren't fought on foreign soil, but in places that should have felt like home. The hum of the bar's old air conditioner was the only sound left after the officers walked back to their table, still holding Marcus and Elijah's IDs. The room was a picture of uneasy quiet, a silence so sharp it could cut through stone. Every eye flicked toward the twins, then back down, pretending not to stare. The bartender pretended to wipe a glass that was already spotless. Even the jukebox had stopped playing, its last tune fading like a whisper lost to tension. Behind the counter, the older officer, Sergeant Miller, typed the names into his tablet with casual arrogance, a smirk curling on his lips. His partner, Officer Blake, leaned in beside him, trying to look confident, but clearly unsure. "Won't take long," Miller muttered, but as soon as the system loaded the results, his smirk vanished. The glow from the screen reflected in his widening eyes, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a flicker of fear. Blake noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" he whispered. Miller didn't answer. His hand hovered over the tablet, as if touching it had burned him. On the screen, in bold letters, it read, "Marcus Cole, U.S. Navy Captain. Elijah Cole, U.S. Navy SEAL Commander." For a second, neither man moved. The weight of the revelation pressed down like thunder. The two men they had just questioned, just humiliated in front of an entire room, weren't random strangers. They were decorated heroes. Miller swallowed hard, his face draining of color. Blake looked between the screen and the brothers sitting quietly at the far end of the room. They're calm now, terrifying in its quiet strength. Marcus sat upright, sipping his water as if he didn't notice the sudden shift in the air, while Elijah's gaze remained on the rain outside, his expression unreadable. Finally, Miller stood, his boots suddenly sounding too loud against the wooden floor. The conversations that had begun to murmur died again, leaving nothing but silence and the echo of his steps. He approached their table slowly, his earlier confidence now replaced with unease. The brothers looked up as he stopped before them. Marcus's eyes met his, calm but unblinking. "Is something wrong, officer?" he asked, in that steady tone, the kind of tone used by men who'd commanded teams through chaos and fire. Miller hesitated, then cleared his throat. His partner, standing slightly behind him, blurted out before he could stop himself, "No, sir. Not at all, sir." The last word hung in the air. "Sir," sharp, loud, and unmistakable. Heads turned. The bartender froze mid-motion. Someone at the counter nearly dropped a glass. It rolled off and shattered on the floor, but no one reacted. The air inside the bar changed. The same people who had looked at the brothers with suspicion now looked at them with awe, shame, and quiet regret. Elijah slowly turned from the window, his calm gaze locking on the trembling officer. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence that followed was heavier than any lecture. Miller fumbled with his words, his voice shaky. Captain Cole? Commander Cole? We didn't realize. Marcus raised a hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. You didn't have to, he said softly, his voice low, but carrying the weight of authority and disappointment. You just had to show respect, the same way you expect it. The officer's throat tightened as he looked down, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. Around them, the once cold room now burned with guilt. People who had stayed silent before now wished they hadn't. The bartender, red-faced, mumbled, "Your meals are on the house, gentlemen." Marcus gave a faint, tired smile, not out of satisfaction, but sadness. "Thank you," he said simply. He didn't need free food. He needed decency. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but razor-sharp. "You never know who you're talking to," he said. "That's why it's better to treat everyone with respect before you find out too late." His words hit harder than any weapon could. The officers nodded stiffly, retreating a few steps back, their authority stripped bare. Marcus and Elijah finished their meal in silence, every bite echoing through the hushed bar. When they finally stood to leave, the crowd parted instinctively, not out of fear, but reverence. As they stepped out into the rain, Marcus glanced over his shoulder one last time. The officers were still standing there, stunned and speechless, the lesson carved into their faces. Outside, the storm had eased, and the brothers walked quietly toward their car, the neon glow of the bar fading behind them. Elijah chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You think they'll remember this night?" he asked. Marcus smiled faintly, unlocking the door. "Oh, they'll remember," he said, "because tonight, respect learned the hard way." For a few long seconds, no one in the bar dared to move. The air was heavy, thick with shame and realization. The bartender, red-faced and sweating, rushed forward with trembling hands, wiping the counter that didn't need cleaning, as if that could erase the tension hanging over the room. I'm sorry, gentlemen," he muttered, setting down a fresh glass of water. "Didn't mean any disrespect." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of guilt pressing down on every word. Marcus glanced up at him, his calm gaze softening the man's panic. "It's not about what you meant," he said quietly. "It's about what you did." The bartender froze, unsure how to reply. Behind him, the two police officers still stood near the door, their earlier arrogance gone, replaced by awkward stillness. Officer Miller finally stepped forward, his voice unsteady. "We didn't realize who you were, sir." "We were just," but before he could finish, Elijah raised his hand gently, signaling for him to stop. The younger twin's tone was calm, yet his words carried the weight of something deeper than anger, something that made the whole room listen. "That's exactly the problem," Elijah said. "You saw two men and made your judgment. You didn't see who we are. You just assumed." His voice was soft, but it echoed through the silence like thunder. There was no hatred in his eyes, only quiet disappointment, the kind that cut deeper than rage. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his posture still composed, his expression steady. His calmness carried authority, the kind built through years of discipline and leadership, not power or pride. He looked around the bar, meeting the eyes of those who had watched the scene unfold, their earlier curiosity now replaced with guilt. "Respect," Marcus began slowly, his tone low, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Isn't something you give to a uniform or a title. It's something you give to a person." His words hung in the air, simple but unshakable. A few people lowered their eyes, unable to meet his steady gaze. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, faces flushed with the quiet shame of realizing their own silence had made them complicit. The bartender opened his mouth to apologize again, but Elijah shook his head gently. "We don't need apologies," he said softly. "We just need people to see before they judge." For a moment, it was as if time stood still. Even the rain outside had softened, the rhythm against the windows steady and gentle. Officer Blake, the younger of the two cops, swallowed hard. "We were wrong," he admitted quietly. "We should have treated you with respect from the start." His partner, Miller, nodded, his pride stripped away. "You're right, sir. No excuses." Marcus looked at them both, then gave a small, understanding nod. "That's how change starts," he said simply, "by admitting when you're wrong." The bartender exhaled, shoulders slumping with relief, though the guilt still lingered in his eyes. Around the room, people began to whisper softly, not gossip this time, but words of reflection. The bar, once filled with suspicion, now felt like a place where a lesson had been quietly but powerfully delivered. Elijah stood first, his movements calm and deliberate, while Marcus followed. The two brothers didn't storm out or raise their voices. They simply prepared to leave, their presence speaking louder than anything they could have said. Before stepping away, Marcus placed a few bills on the table, far more than the cost of their meal. "For the next person who comes in and feels out of place," he said gently to the bartender. The man's eyes welled with emotion, and he nodded, unable to speak. Elijah paused by the officers, giving them a small nod of his own. "Don't let tonight make you ashamed," he said. "Let it make you better." The sincerity in his tone broke through whatever walls of pride were left. Both officers straightened, their faces somber but grateful. As the twins stepped outside, the cool night air met them like a quiet cleansing. The neon bar sign flickered behind them, the letters glowing faintly against the wet pavement. Elijah looked up at the sky, the rain now just a light drizzle. "You think they'll remember this?" he asked quietly. Marcus smiled faintly, his breath visible in the cold air. "They'll remember," he said, "because sometimes respect isn't taught, it's earned by the way you hold your ground." And as the two men walked toward their car, the world behind them felt just a little bit changed, not by anger or revenge, but by dignity and grace. The bar was silent, not the loud, uncomfortable silence that follows an argument, but a stillness filled with reflection. The clinking of glasses had stopped, conversations had died mid-sentence, and every pair of eyes followed Marcus and Elijah Cole as they prepared to leave. Marcus stood tall, his composure unbroken, yet his expression carried a quiet depth that made everyone around him uneasy in their own guilt. Without a word, he reached into his wallet and took out a thick fold of bills. The bartender's eyes widened as Marcus placed the money on the counter, far more than the cost of their meal. "Sir, you don't have to," the bartender began, his voice trembling, but Marcus stopped him with a calm shake of his head. "It's not about what I have to do," he said softly, his voice steady and calm, yet heavy with meaning. "It's a gesture, not for what happened tonight, but for what can change." Those words seemed to hang in the air, echoing through the minds of everyone present. It wasn't spoken like a lecture, nor meant to shame anyone. It was a simple truth, delivered with grace, the kind of truth that stays with you long after it's spoken. Elijah stepped forward next, his movements precise and quiet, carrying the quiet strength of a man used to discipline and control. He reached up and removed his cap, dark blue, bearing the golden trident of the U.S. Navy SEALs. The insignia gleamed under the low bar lights, catching the attention of every soul in the room. Without a word, he placed it gently on the counter beside the money. The gesture was small, but its meaning was profound. He looked around the bar at the bartender, at the two humbled officers, and at the patrons, who now watched in reverent silence. "Next time," Elijah said, his voice calm yet firm, "maybe see before you judge." It was not a command or a scolding, it was advice, offered with quiet mercy. His words carried no bitterness, only the weight of wisdom earned through hardship and understanding. For a moment, no one breathed. The bartender's eyes glistened with shame and gratitude, while the officers shifted uneasily, their uniforms now feeling heavier than ever. The air in the bar, once filled with judgment, was now thick with respect. As the twins turned to leave, the wooden floor creaked under their boots. The sound of their steps was the only noise in the room. Every gaze followed them, not because of their titles or uniforms, but because of the way they carried themselves, with dignity, even after being wronged. Just as they reached the door, Officer Miller, the older of the two, straightened his shoulders. His hand rose slowly, almost hesitantly at first, but then with conviction. He raised his hand in a crisp, silent salute. It wasn't the kind of salute given out of duty or protocol. It was one born from respect, from humility, from the acknowledgement of men greater than oneself. His partner followed, eyes burning with emotion, joining him in the salute. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, as if something sacred had passed through the room, a few others, civilians, ordinary people, stood up too. Some placed their hands over their hearts. Others bowed their heads slightly. No one spoke. They didn't have to. The gesture said everything words could not. Marcus turned briefly at the door, his eyes softening as he saw the salute. He gave a small nod, a silent acceptance, a mark of forgiveness. Elijah looked at his brother, then at the crowd, and there was a faint smile on his face, the kind that carried both sadness and pride. Together, they stepped out into the cool night. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under the pale glow of streetlights. Their footsteps echoed softly on the wet pavement as they walked away. Behind them, through the bar's windows, the patrons still stood, not frozen in guilt, but changed by what they had witnessed. The bartender reached out and touched the navy cap on the counter as if it were something sacred, his fingers trembling. Officer Miller lowered his salute at last, exhaling slowly, a weight lifted from his heart. He looked at his partner and said quietly, "That's the kind of respect you can't order. You earn it." His words broke the silence, and heads nodded in quiet agreement. For a long time, no one dared to move, as though they feared breaking the fragile sense of understanding that filled the room. Outside, the Cole brothers disappeared into the misty night, not as men demanding recognition, but as men who had reminded a room full of strangers what honor truly meant. True honor, the bar would remember, isn't worn on your chest or sewn into your uniform. It's carried in your heart, in how you treat others, especially when the world isn't watching.